At one point in your life, you have performed a poem in front of the stage. You may already have an idea on how to perform a poem, but this lecture video will help you not just perform, but also to understand the nature and structure of poetry. You will learn how to analyze your selected poem, understand the meaning of the poem, and carefully plan on how you will perform it. Understanding the nature and structure of the poem we selected will make our analysis and rehearsal easier. The first thing we need to know is that poetry is compact. It means that in a short piece of writing, shorter than prose, you can feel the emotional weight of the content, as well as the creativity of the piece found in its patterns the poem created. How the logical and emotive content are weaved and merged is the foundation of the appreciation of poetry. In understanding and analyzing poetry, we must take note that each word in a poem carries distinct denotative or dictionary meaning and connotative or a suggested or implied related meaning. We must also take note that each word harmonizes with the sound pattern. When performing poetry, we must take note that poetry records experience to be shared. It doesn't mean that it needs to be explained, as poetry sometimes provides us only a segment of experience. Nonetheless, it is meant to share an experience, and as performers, our task is to share it. So, how do we start? The first step in understanding and evaluating a poem is to read the entire work to get a general idea of what it says. Your initial response to a poem may not be in terms of idea or logical content at all, but rather in terms of emotion. Read the poem aloud several times. Permit yourself the luxury of a completely subjective response before beginning an objective analysis. We can analyze the poem by classifying it first. We classify a poem based on who is speaking the poem, to whom the person is speaking, and whether the experience is being revealed directly or overheard or a personal utterance of a single speaker. There are three types of poems that we can use: narrative poetry, lyric poetry, and dramatic poetry. Narrative poetry is poetry that tells a story or shows a plot or series of events. When we examine a narrative poem, we look at the establishment of time and place, the development of characters and their relationships with each other, the traits of the characters, the situation in the setting, and the interdependence of all these factors. Usually, the persona in narrative poetry is the narrator, and often, the poem includes dialogue. When you present a narrative poem, you take the role of a storyteller. There are three common types of narrative poetry. The first is popular ballad, which is a short, swift, or stark narrative with a simple plot and a refrain, which is a rhythmic and repeated lines that reveal important aspects of the speaker's life and reflect the unique world of the tale. The next type is a metric tale, which is a novel or short story in verse form. The last type is an epic, which is a highly poetic piece with an extreme length, an elevated tone when performed, and with complex and elaborate lines and characters. Notice here that these types of narrative poetry have the elements of a story, which are settings, characters, a plot, and a climax. The next type of poetry we will explore is lyric poetry. It is usually a short poem that is more focused on sharing an emotional experience. With this, the performer must be able to master techniques in performance and be able to provide a good introduction of the poem to the audience prior to the performance. The audience must be able to have the time to hear the words, recreate the images, and set up the response from the performance. Usually, the persona in a lyric poem is a single speaker, and their primary purpose is to share an emotional experience invoked in the poem. There are four types of lyric poetry. The first type is the reflective lyric, which is the persona's emotional response through recall and reflection or contemplation. The next is elegy, or a poem that expresses grief, usually at someone's death. The third type is the ode, which is a dignified poem in formal language and structure and is usually performed when celebrating an event or someone's victory. The last type is the sonnet, which is most seen in most of Shakespeare's poems. Sonnets have a fixed structure, usually written in 14 lines in iambic pentameter. These types differ in structure or form, but their common purpose is to convey an emotion. The last type of poetry that we will explore is dramatic poetry. It concerns works that center on a character who is in conflict with external or internal forces and whose development is revealed without a third-person narrator. In narrative poetry, the persona is the narrator. But in dramatic poetry, the persona is the character itself. There are four types of dramatic poetry. The first type is dramatic narrative, in which a series of events are told by the persona affected by these events. The next type is the dramatic lyric, which is a reflection of the poet's subjective responses, thoughts, and aspirations. The third is the dramatic monologue, which is spoken by a single character created outside the poet's own personality. The last type is the soliloquy, which is the same as monologue in form, but there are no other characters being addressed, only the persona itself. Dramatic poetry focuses more on the first-person point of view, and the persona is actively involved in the events of the poem. Now, what are the elements that we need to consider when analyzing a poem? Here are 5 major elements that we can look at. The first element is the use of figurative language. Earlier, we discussed that each word and line have denotative and connotative meanings. Looking at the denotative meanings is easy, but in order to look at the connotations, we must look at how figurative language was used in the selected poem. We may look at allusions or the indirect references that imply a meaning of the piece. We may also look at the figures of speech used, which compares the meaning to a particular symbol or make an abstract concept into a concrete one. We can also look at the sensory appeals used or invoked in the poem. The words and lines in the poem may lead you to imagine seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, or touching something. Allusions, figures of speech, and sensory appeals are examined to look at the figurative language used in the poem. The second element is the use of poetic syntax. Here we will look at the stanzas, which organizes the contents of the poem. We consider stanzas not just minor units of thought, but also a unit of sound. We will talk about stanzas later. The third element is the use of tone color. Tone color is the combination of vowels and consonants to help achieve a particular effect. To identify and examine tone color in a poem, we need to take a look at the choice and arrangement of words and the sounds of which words are composed. We can also see this through the use of rhymes and stresses, which will be discussed later. The fourth element is the use of music of poetry. Some poems are written or meant to be sung. This is important when you plan on performing a poem. The interpreter who chooses to perform the lyrics of songs must resolve 2 specific and related problems. First, will you perform both the music and the lyrics? Recognize that some lyrics need the music to survive. Without the superior musical support, the words seem lifeless and obvious. Second, if you choose to perform only the lyrics, take care that the musical setting you may be hearing in your ears does not intrude onto what members of your audience hear in their ears. To perform only the lyrics, you must concentrate completely on the situation, on the natural music inherent in the words chosen by the lyricist, and on the careful patterning apparent in the poem's structure. The final element is the title. Titles help us to decide what a poem is about as well as guide us on our way. When performing a poem, introducing the title, the author, and parts that will set the imagination of the audience are important. Sometimes, the title is picked from a line in a poem. Some titles are a summary or essence of the poem, and some don't have titles. But if the poet gave the poem a title, Your audience should know it through the introduction. We now have an idea of the nature of poetry. Now let's look at how poems are creatively written. We earlier discussed that poetry is compact, and because it is compact, it condenses emotions, sensations, incidents, and language. That means that the more we read the poem or see it performed, the more our analysis expands. When we look at the structure of poetry, we look at the length of the lines and stanzas, the flow of sounds from each lines, and the rhythm of the poem. The elements that we will explore are stanza and verse structure, prosody, and cadences. The first element to look at is the stanza and verse structure. Different lines in stanzas move in different ways, so we explore both the stress and the flow of sounds. Because we are always caught off by sounds, we detect how they are repeated, most obviously in rhyme. All these components of sound patterns cry out for the many skills of the interpreter because they fulfill their functions only when the poem lives in performance. These patterns may surface when we look at the verse structure, which are either conventional or free verse. Conventional poetry has a clearly discernible pattern of stresses. There is a fixed metrical fit or grouping of the stresses into traditional patterns. There is presence of a fixed number of lines in each stanza, and each line has a fixed length. The free verse has varying line lengths and arrangement of stresses within lines. It is frequently not rhymed, no pattern of metrical fit, and its rhythm is based on cadence or sound rather than meter. The blank verse is a special type of conventional poetry that doesn't rhyme and has no recurring stanza pattern because the stanzas are divided according to the development of the thought and thus vary in length. The structure of verses and stanzas contributes significantly to the poem's pattern of sound. The next element is prosody. Prosody involves stress, intonation, and rhythm. Prosody is used to determine the meaning of the line. A metrical foot is a grouping of stressed and unstressed syllables into a unit. The most common feet in English poetry are the iamb, anapest, trochee, dactyl, spondy, and pyrrhic. A line is the combination of the foot used and the number of feet it contains. It can be a monometer or 1 foot, dimeter or 2 feet, trimeter or 3 feet, tetrameter or 4 feet, or pentameter or 5 feet, and so on. Thus, a line of 5 iambic feet is spoken of as an iambic pentameter. When you scan a poem, take note of how words and lines are stressed. But you must also remember that there is no one right way of reading a poem. So read the poem on how the lines or words invoke an emotion, and this will help you see the stress, flow, and rhythm. The last element we will look at is cadence. A cadence is simply an uninterrupted flow of sound. Each pause establishes a new cadence. Cadences are also measured by the number of syllables they contain. Cadence will help us map out the poem when we plan our performance. It suggests that the speed of the poem and the mood it wants to convey. A careful analysis of the cadences and stresses in a poem will convince you that conventional poetry can't be read like a nursery rhyme. Even the discipline inherent in free verse stops us from reading this type of poetry as if it were a prose. If you follow the clues scrupulously and scrutinize every syllable, your rigorous analysis will greatly increase your artistic ability because it will map the diversions in your regular route. It often leads performers to an amazed appreciation of the poet's artistic achievement. We learned a lot of elements that we need to consider when we read, analyze, understand, and perform a poem. These elements help us to appreciate the poem well, not just the meaning of the poem, but also the creativity of the poem and how it shows emotion. But we must be careful in dissecting poems and looking at the structure. Remember that structure informs content, and content derives from structure. No single aspect of the structure is the entire work, nor should any part be exhibited for its own sake. In analysis, poems can be astonishing aggregates of interconnected parts. In performance, poems must be bold.